security realm or indeed on the economy. I promised at the general election to bring stability back to the economy. As a result of that stability, interest rates have been cut 3 times since the general election. That's a far cry from the 11% inflation and the interest rate hikes that we saw under the previous government. And that's only been possible because we've put our public finances on a firm footing, and we've also put our public services on a firm footing, which is what I did in the budget last year.
In a recent appearance on Trevor Phillips' show, Rachel Reeves, the shadow chancellor, found herself at the centre of a heated debate as she faced tough questions about the economic direction of the United Kingdom under Labour's leadership. The conversation quickly turned to the financial challenges facing the country, especially in light of mounting evidence of deteriorating living standards and growing economic instability. However, rather than acknowledging the gravity of the situation, Reeves maintained a confident and optimistic stance, attempting to reassure both the public and her critics that the economy was on the mend. When asked about the impact of recent tax increases, particularly in the context of the cost of living crisis, Reeves confidently dismissed concerns. She argued that, had the Labour government taken a different approach last October, the country would not be in a position to face the current international crises, such as the aggression from Russia. Instead of addressing the broader concerns over inflation, rising energy costs and stagnating wages, she focused on defending the government's fiscal decisions, including redirecting funds from overseas aid to bolster defence spending. While acknowledging that these decisions were controversial, Reeves emphasized that they were necessary to safeguard national security and public services, presenting them as a calculated move rather than a compromise of democratic values. The interview took a more contentious turn when the discussion shifted to a recent report by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which predicted a significant decline in living standards over the next 5 years. According to the foundation, poverty levels were expected to rise sharply, with the poorest households bearing the brunt of the economic fallout. Yet Reeves vehemently rejected these claims, dismissing the report as unfounded. Instead, she boldly asserted that living standards would improve during the course of the current parliament, pointing to rising wages and a decrease in inflation as evidence of economic recovery. This defiant dismissal of expert warnings led to an outcry from many, who saw her optimism as out of touch with the harsh realities faced by millions of households struggling to make ends meet. As Reeves continued to push her narrative of economic recovery, the contrast between her words and the experiences of ordinary people became more apparent. While she argued that wages were rising faster than inflation, the reality for many workers was far different. With inflation still hovering at uncomfortably high levels, the wage increases that Reeves touted were insufficient to offset the soaring costs of basic necessities like food, fuel, and housing. As public frustration mounted, the gap between Reeves' upbeat rhetoric and the lived experience of the British public widened, leaving many to wonder whether her confidence was genuine or merely a politically expedient attempt to deflect criticism. In the face of mounting opposition and growing skepticism, Rachel Reeves' appearance on Trevor Phillips' show served to further highlight the widening divide between the Labour Party's leadership and the electorate. Despite her attempts to downplay the severity of the economic crisis, her refusal to engage with the uncomfortable truths about the UK's financial struggles left many questioning her grasp on the issues at hand. Rachel Reeves' interview on Trevor Phillips' show has sparked considerable backlash due to her confident dismissal of critical economic report, notably the recent warning from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. This foundation's report painted a bleak future for many British households, predicting a drastic decline in living standards over the next 5 years. The report argued that the poorest would be hardest hit, as inflation continued to outpace wage growth, leaving families struggling to afford basic necessities like food, energy, and housing. Yet, in the face of these dire predictions, Reeves confidently rejected the findings, presenting an optimistic picture of the UK's future under Labour. She claimed that living standards would rise during the current parliament, and that the economy was on track to improve despite the challenges posed by inflation and the global economic slowdown. Her outright rejection of the report's warnings drew sharp criticism. Critics quickly pointed out that Reeves' optimism seemed disconnected from the reality faced by millions of working-class families. While she cited rising wages and falling inflation as evidence of a recovering economy, the reality for many was far less promising. With inflation hovering around 10%, the modest wage increases reported were still insufficient to keep pace with the rising cost of living. The public's anger only deepened as it became apparent that Reeves' optimistic view overlooked the financial hardships many people were grappling with on a daily basis. while she heralded an economic recovery that had yet to materialize for most. The stark contrast between her words and the reality of rising costs left many questioning her ability to relate to the struggles of everyday Britons. Reeves' refusal to acknowledge the real challenges many families were facing only further fueled the perception that she and Labour were out of touch with the electorate. By dismissing the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's findings as inaccurate, she seemed to downplay the legitimate concerns of the people who were struggling to make ends meet. Her emphasis on the supposed economic gains was seen as an attempt to divert attention from the government's failure to address the immediate needs of the most vulnerable. Critics argued that such a response reflected Labour's deeper failure to understand the nuances of the cost of living crisis, and that the party's leadership was increasingly failing to provide tangible solutions to the very problems they promised to address. The disconnect between Reeves' statements and the lived reality of millions only seemed to deepen as the interview continued. Instead of offering concrete plans or acknowledging the difficult circumstances that many families were facing, Reeves focused on defending the government's actions and insisting that things were improving. This focus on defending the narrative of recovery, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, made her remarks seem increasingly out of touch. As the interview unfolded, it became clear that Rachel Reeves' refusal to engage with the realities of the economic crisis had left her vulnerable to accusations of political insensitivity. It was no longer just a debate about economic policy. It was a stark illustration of how disconnected the Labour leadership seemed from the people they were supposed to represent. Rachel Reeves' refusal to acknowledge the deepening financial struggles faced by millions of Britons during her interview has raised serious concerns about Labour's ability to address the country's economic woes. While the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report highlighted a troubling outlook for the UK's poorest households, Reeves maintained a tone of optimism that many found startling. She dismissed the Foundation's grim predictions of worsening living standards and rising poverty, instead focusing on what she claimed was an improving economy. According to Reeves, wages were rising faster than inflation, and living standards would increase in the coming years. Yet, for many, these claims seemed disconnected from the harsh realities of everyday life. With inflation still soaring, the modest wage increases that had been reported were still far below the level needed to keep pace with the skyrocketing cost of living. For working families already struggling with rising food, energy, and housing costs, Reeves' assurances seemed hollow and out of touch. Her unwavering optimism not only raised questions about her understanding of the economic crisis, but also exposed a larger issue within Labour: the party's failure to recognise the depth of the problems facing the electorate. Critics pointed out that while the economy may have shown some signs of recovery on paper, the actual experiences of millions of families were far from rosy. Many households were seeing their real incomes shrink, even as wages struggled to keep up with inflation. The rising cost of essentials combined with stagnant wages meant that large sections of the population were falling further behind. By insisting that things were improving, Reeves seemed to disregard the struggles of these families, offering a narrative that felt disconnected from the economic reality many were facing. Her approach also failed to address the fact that, for many people, the financial strain was not just a short-term issue, but a long-term concern that had been building for years. The stagnation of wages, combined with cuts to public services and rising taxes, had created an environment where even those in full-time employment were finding it increasingly difficult to make ends meet. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report had pointed out that the situation for the poorest households would continue to worsen, yet Reeves brushed off these warnings as unfounded. This left many questioning whether Labour, under her leadership, truly understood the scope of the cost of living crisis, or whether it was more concerned with maintaining a narrative of recovery. The growing disconnect between Labour's optimistic rhetoric and the public's lived experiences could have serious consequences for the party's future. With the cost of living crisis showing no signs of abating, Labour's failure to take meaningful action or offer practical solutions only fueled doubts about the party's ability to effectively govern. As many voters began to lose faith in Labour's ability to lead, Reeves' refusal to engage with the harsh economic realities faced by working families risked alienating a crucial segment of the electorate, leaving Labour vulnerable in the next election. Rachel Reeves' response to the worsening economic situation and the criticisms of Labour's policies has sparked considerable debate, particularly in regard to her portrayal of the economic outlook and the reality faced by millions of struggling families. During a high-profile interview, Reeves confidently rejected warnings from organizations like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which forecast a sharp decline in living standards. Instead, she chose to emphasize what she perceived as positive economic trends, such as rising wages and a reduction in inflation. However, for many, her comments seemed increasingly out of touch with the lived experience of the public, especially for working-class families, who were grappling with the escalating cost of living. The contradictions in Reeves' statements became more apparent when she claimed that living standards were improving, despite widespread evidence to the contrary. While she pointed to an increase in wages, it was clear that the modest rises were still far from enough to keep pace with the cost of essential goods and services, particularly as inflation remained high. For many households, the gains in income were quickly eroded by soaring costs for food, energy, and housing. This stark mismatch between Reeves' optimistic predictions and the harsh reality on the ground raised serious concerns about the Labour Party's grasp on the economic challenges facing the nation. By downplaying the significance of inflation and rising costs, Reeves risked alienating the very voters who had once placed their trust in Labour to advocate for the working class. These were voters who had seen their wages stagnate, their bills rise, and their savings dwindle. For them, the reality of their financial situation felt far more urgent than the government's optimistic rhetoric. What seemed to be missing from Reeves' narrative was a true acknowledgement of the struggles facing millions, particularly the most vulnerable in society, who were hit hardest by the economic crisis. Additionally, Reeves' rejection of expert warnings about rising poverty levels and falling living standards highlighted a troubling lack of engagement with the realities of growing inequality. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report emphasized the growing divide between the rich and the poor, yet Reeves' insistence on presenting an optimistic picture of economic recovery ignored the deeper structural issues at play. Poverty rates were expected to increase, particularly among working families, but Reeves chose instead to focus on broader, more general economic indicators that felt increasingly irrelevant to the families who were experiencing the crisis firsthand. This failure to engage with the real concerns of the public raised doubts about Labour's credibility in addressing the cost of living crisis. While the party had long positioned itself as the voice of the working class, Reeves' dismissal of the harsh economic realities faced by millions cast doubt on its ability to effectively govern. As Labour's internal fractures deepened and public support continued to erode, it became clear that the party's response to the crisis would play a pivotal role in determining its future trajectory. Would Labour acknowledge the growing divide and take bold action? Or would it continue to rely on optimistic projections that failed to resonate with voters? The stakes were high, and with each passing day, the party's ability to mount a credible defense of its economic strategy seemed to diminish. The Labour Party's handling of the crisis surrounding Rachel Reeves has highlighted an urgent need for political change. Despite the party's claims of economic recovery and improvements in living standards, the reality for many families is far more bleak. With inflation still high and wages stagnant, the Labour government's promises seem increasingly disconnected from the struggles faced by the public. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report predicts a sharp decline in living standards, yet Rachel Reeves has dismissed these concerns, insisting that the economy is improving. This has sparked outrage, with critics accusing her of being out of touch with the real needs of working families. The government's lack of concrete solutions to address inflation and the rising cost of living has left many feeling betrayed. Instead of offering substantial measures to ease the financial burden, Labour seems to focus on empty optimism, claiming wages are rising and inflation is slowing, both of which contradict the lived experiences of millions. Meanwhile, the increasing financial strain on households is exacerbated by tax hikes, including those on national insurance, which critics argue only discourage hiring and suppress wages. With no clear plan to tackle these issues, Labour's credibility is in jeopardy, and its future in British politics remains uncertain. The recent political turmoil surrounding Rachel Reeves has ignited a fierce debate about the direction of the Labour Party. As the government grapples with economic challenges, the public is growing increasingly disillusioned with the party's promises. Rachel Reeves, who once seemed like the hope of Labour's recovery, now finds herself at the centre of a scandal that threatens the party's credibility. Her dismissal of expert reports, such as those from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which warned of worsening living standards, has further alienated her from those who are struggling to make ends meet. Her insistence that wages are rising faster than inflation and that living standards are improving has been met with growing skepticism. Many see her rhetoric as disconnected from the reality of rising costs and stagnant wages that households across the country are facing. As inflation continues to outpace wage growth, the public's frustration is palpable. The promise of economic recovery seems increasingly hollow as families feel the squeeze of higher prices and stagnant incomes. Labour's failure to address these issues head-on, coupled with a lack of substantial policy proposals, has left many questioning the party's ability to govern effectively. Moreover, the party's broken promises, such as the recent council tax increases despite prior pledges to freeze them, have only deepened the sense of betrayal among its supporters. As Labour's internal divisions grow more pronounced, with factions blaming each other for the party's failures, the public's trust in its ability to lead is eroding fast. In a time of crisis, Labour's inability to provide clear, practical solutions only seems to fuel the growing sense of unease about its future in British politics. See you soon.